The next session shifts slightly to focus on controls, where we're going to be talking about FAIR CAM and trying to understand how using FAIR and MITRE controls can impact risks. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to welcome back to the stage Tom as a moderator and our panelists, Frédéric Bouveresse, who's Cyber Risk Governance Specialist at Alstom, and Francesco Chiarini, who's Global Head of Technology and Resilience at Sandoz.
Hello, everybody, again. This is the last session of the day. Well, the second last session, if I'm truthful. It's the last panel of the day. So better yet. So, you know, we've spoken about regulation and resilience, but we haven't really defined what resilience really is, right? So in this panel, we're going to talk about resilience. We're also going to talk about how you can think about resilience in terms of controls and go through some of the tools that we can use to model and not just use mental models. How you can model control efficacy using FAIR, but also introduce things like MITRE, which are used within the first line of defense, into that conversation. And then think a little bit about FAIR CAM, which is kind of the future, we believe is the future of how you can model control efficacy. So I've got Frédéric and Francesco. Frédéric is from Alstom, and they are doing introducing control measurement into risk analysis. So we're going to go through that in a bit of detail. Francesco is, and I'm going to let the guys introduce themselves in more detail because I can't do that justice. Francesco is really, I guess, Mr. Resilience from my perspective, and he'll tell us a little bit about resilience, what it is, how you can model it, and how you can think about it. So I think we don't, back to I guess today we spoke about the fact that as a profession we don't always speak the same language. So what does resilience really mean? So let me just click ahead. All right. Okay. So I'm just going to talk a little bit, and this is really high level, right? I mean, we could spend probably the entire day thinking about, you know, how you can scope a risk scenario, how you can think about how controls impact it. This is just kind of introducing some ideas and some suggestions for the audience to bring this back to your organizations or do some of your own research. But the main point is that you can take a risk assessment and use threat intelligence, think about a MITRE tactics, think about what techniques are being used, what controls might influence those techniques, and use FAIR to build a risk model to think about that. You can also introduce things like key risk indicators, and of course you need control frameworks. And we spoke a lot about control frameworks today. They exist in the industry. We all need to use them. They have some issues, but they're there, and we need to acknowledge that. And FAIR CAM is a model that you can use to map between control frameworks and some of the factors of risk. And I'm not going to go into FAIR CAM in detail. Jack gave us a preview of it earlier on, but there are some white papers on it on the FAIR Institute website. Once you do that, you can then start thinking about performing return on investment analysis of different control types, in particular in the context of resilience. Resilience controls can be very costly sometimes, and as Jack mentioned, perhaps there are resilience controls that we haven't considered that might have a better return on investment than we think. So in advocating for this approach, we've listed some, I guess, elements of a toolkit or a kind of cookbook. Again, we could probably do a masterclass that will last 2 days on how to actually do this. And hopefully we'll get to do that in the years to come. But just introducing the idea this is possible, and Frédéric is going to talk about how he's doing it at Alstom, and it may not be exactly the same as this, but it's good for you guys, right? Yeah. And it's pretty much state of the art, actually, as far as I'm concerned. So over to Frédéric, and maybe you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, hello. So I'm Frédéric Bouveresse. I'm working in Alstom. I'm cyber risk specialist working in GRC team. So yes, we have implemented the model of risk assessment, and we have actually assessing controls with FAIR methodology. Not with CAM yet, but it's probably the next steps. So what we have, maybe you can show the slide. So what was really important at the beginning when we have implemented this model is to have the framework, the external framework. that was important to, in order to have the kind of fuel in the engine to motivate all the stakeholders around one target. And the target was the certification. So when you have something to motivate everyone, then it gets things easier to...
And that's super important because we spoke about the concept of use cases. Why are we doing this in the first place, right? And in your case, it was certifying. And I mean, Alstom, I guess what you do is you physical security is very important, right? And the safety of your people who are
correct, yeah. And you cannot count on the self-consciousness of people, you know, saying, oh, I have to do this because I want to protect the company, etc. You have to use a target, and this is the fuel that we have used, yeah. And around this target of certifications, then so we had to set expectations in terms of control, and for that we had to be able to measure our controls. This is where we have used the FAIR model.
And when you say certification, this is an internal certification of a piece of technology that you build or construct according to a certain standard, or to be able to demonstrate to external.
That's basically ISO 27001. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
So that, as everyone was involved in this certification, that's what we have used this model. Yeah.
And we spoke a bit about as well about thinking about, and I think Rob made reference to it in the previous panel, is that if you're looking at controls, you can look at controls across an entire organization, but that level of abstraction can be, it's okay for some use cases, but not for all. I think what you guys do is you bring it down a level to specific applications or services, right?
Exactly, yeah.
We'll look at that on the next slide.
Yeah, it's in the next slide, yeah. And so it's important as well, it was in the previous slide, but important to ensure the communication for that, and to make sure that which stakeholders you are speaking to, you are addressing this model. Because they have constraints, of course, and we have heard that many stakeholders here have talked about that here today. So we have to explain why we are doing this, what's the objective, in order to reach the target. So that's the challenge.
And Frédéric, who are the stakeholders? Like, if you typically go through this process, how many people are involved?
So,
and how long does it take, actually?
Yeah, it's a lot of people, because it's... we have several departments, 10, 15 departments, and process owners are different. So, I mean, there are different kind of stakeholders, and I mean, depending on the level of granularity, and I will talk about this challenge of granularity. If you are at the granularity of the asset, you can have business stakeholders, solution architects, security architects, and you have to make them speak together. I mean, we all have the same issues in the day-to-day. And if you have at the highest level, you have process owners. So it's a lot of people and lot of gaps with security policies to deal with, and you cannot put them all in a room in the same time. So that's the challenge.
And when you talk about asset, just for the audience, maybe, but are we're not talking about a server, I guess. We're talking about a more of a service, or is it both?
It could be both. It could be both. Yeah. Primary assets, secondary assets, both covered. So yeah. So it's a challenge.
What's interesting here is you can use the FAIR model to go down to a very low level of granularity, if necessary, but equally, choose what you want to look at: business process, service, application, down to a technical component.
That's what we have done. Yes. So thanks to the CITEL platform, we have based the model on. I mean, the primary assets are, of course, the business processes, and the secondary assets are actually, we have made the choice to put the IT department. So, for example, IT department network would be in charge of all the assets related to network. So that's a choice to make it high level, but to not mix between the high level overview of the risk management and the risk management at asset level. And we have a mechanism to integrate together both mechanisms with the controls.
Super. And I know we'll get to Francesco in a minute, but I know it's one of your passions is to try to think about what assets make up services which may ensure resilience, and that's a big challenge. And I think I spoke with some of our team from the regulator panel this morning about that as well. That organizations need to be able to describe their landscape to the regulators clearly and really understand what are the most important assets and what are we doing to make them resilient.
Yeah, exactly. So in the end, the target is to be able, with the tool, to present our model to the insurance, and to be able to showcase where we are going to this risk level, how we are going to this risk level, to be able to explain the complete mechanism.
And that's, I guess, in an echo to the insurance conversation, I believe that was one of your big use cases, right?
Exactly.
And probably may have paid for the whole risk quantification program itself, right? Is your
indeed.
ability to renegotiate your contract, which is for both the benefit of your insurers and yourself. So that was great to hear. Okay, cool. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about resilience. Yeah, and then we'll kind of go back and bring the two topics together. Okay.
Right. Oh, yes.
Maybe Francesco, you can introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. So, yeah, I have a couple of hats. I'm the head of technology resilience at Sandoz, pharmaceutical company. And as well, I founded the ISSA.org Cyber Resilience Special Interest Group. Now it's the biggest group of ISSA with over 2,000 people, mainly US-based. I'll speak as well about high-value target, a methodology to identify the key assets. Let's start just by defining what is cyber resilience. Basically, it's an ontology problem sometimes, and something that before in your presentation, Jack, it resonated to me to understand. Yeah, the difficulties to explain. Like many people talk about cyber resilience, but many of them speak about different things. So we spent 1.5 years with 20 people, including universities, to find out what are the best definitions of cyber resilience out there. So, we elaborate basically the differences between cybersecurity and cyber resilience into 4 simple elements. First is a matter of controls. Is there another? Oh, no. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay, yeah, got it. Okay, there's an animation. So, matter of control. So you are probably all familiar with NIST 853 controls. That's roughly 1,100 controls. The first key difference is that cyber resilience, if you look at them as a Venn diagram, there's over 200 controls that are cyber resilience controls from NIST 800-160, version 1, version 2, mainly version 2. So if we talk about cyber resilience, but you don't know NIST 800-160, well then, basically, probably what you're looking at is some parts of cyber resilience, but not actually the whole set. NIST 800-160 was born in 2019, and that's when I started working heavily on it, implemented it at Pepsi, at Standard Chartered Bank, and now at Sandoz. And basically, you look at a certain amount of, call them candidate mitigations or contingency planning activities, but as well defense, that you apply only to certain types of assets, which is the second bullet point. So the second bullet point is the traditional business-focused approach on the value of the assets is grounded on ISO 22000, primarily like NIST 834, 84, which is the business value of the loss of availability of an asset. Or oftentimes it's described as the crown jewel approach. Look at the UK regulators, PRA, FCA, and others, which is then the foundation of operational resilience. However, the right way to speak about assets in a cyber resilience context is the one that is the so-called voice of the adversary. So we all know the voice of the customer. It's a technique used in Lean Six Sigma as well. And the voice of the adversary is defined into some MITRE documents from 2012. In fact, MITRE first wrote some of the MITRE craft methodology, cyber resilience engineering framework, and then NIST picked it up over the years. But so the value of the adversary is actually defined like on the, is it the right or the left? Yeah, well, it's my right side. So you have basically, you need to look at not only the impact of losing an asset from a business standpoint, but even how much inherent impact that asset carries from an adversarial standpoint. I'll give you a quick example. We all know that we prioritize domain controllers or Active Directory, right? Because we know that there's a big inherent impact from compromising Active Directory. So that is oftentimes considered a crown jewel because it retains key informational value, right? So it stores credentials so everyone can understand that that is a crown jewel. However, look at something that like SCCM or patching tools or MECM, like anything that is used to then that has certain attributes from, if you look at that asset from as an architect, it is widespread, it has inherent trust, right? It can be, it's tamper-prone, and but it doesn't process any critical information, it just deploys software. If the business loses patching tool, well, the business still goes. Maybe you have to measure the risk of not patching for some time, but that's finessing. But then this is a high-value target from an adversarial standpoint. We see it, we saw it in MGM casinos recently, Black Cat. Now we see Black Cat, there was the healthcare incident. They went after VMware ESX, and then they compromised everything else. So you need to look at this is the way from a cyber resilience standpoint to identify the key assets. Then the other 2 points are, one is, if you look just on every threat scenario, regardless of the depth of or the magnitude or the breadth that it has, then, well, you're doing cybersecurity overall. You take the traditional cybersecurity approach. Resilience is actually the science of anticipation. You deal with the unknown, and you need to keep standing despite the odds. So you need to know your point of no return. So how much loss can you get? But loss cannot be expressed just in RPO or RTO. It's not a loss of time only. It needs to be loss of capability, which is the area between loss of withstand capabilities and loss of recover capabilities, which are 2 of the 4 goals of a cyber-resilient enterprise. So you need to ensure that when you have your threat scenarios, and I heard before about the top 5 threat scenarios or so, can go with top 5, but then you need to know what is, add another layer of classification on the magnitude of these. So it can be, well, this is what I consider this threat scenario as severe, but this is the extreme, right? And this is, for example, what is embedded in in my opinion, a great regulation, which is the UK banking sector regulation for operational resilience. You have there the concept of the important business service, the extreme scenarios, extreme but plausible, and so on. Right, the last component here that is actually linked on the controls as well for the extreme but plausible, you need to remove the assumption that secondary or contingency arrangements work in the extreme scenario. That's the difference between the plausible and extreme. So if you have backup and storage and you have it distributed active-active between primary, secondary data centers, example, right? Then that is still a severe but plausible. You can rely on the backup. But when you talk cyber resilience, you need to really be able to say, well, what if my secondary backup is impacted? So you need to have immutability. That's one of the 9 techniques. And then additionally, you need to try to assume that the adversary is so capable that will compromise your backup and storage environment. So for this, you need to have a tertiary recovery environment. That's sheltered harbor. That's the concept of out-of-band, air gap, cyber recovery, survivability kind of situation. Last one is the focusing on, reducing the likelihood of occurrence or likelihood of impact versus the magnitude of impact. That's where FAIR already has certain elements. I think here, from a cyber resilience standpoint, this means that cyber resilience is composed by 4 goals, 8 objectives, 14 techniques, and 44 approaches. They are all documented in the methodologies. But then, how do you choose your risk strategy for cyber resilience? So you need to have a blueprint, right? You need to have a risk strategy. So you can either start from your impact tolerance statements, if you're lucky to have them, or you start from focusing on reducing the magnitude of impact, because you assume that operational resilience people and cybersecurity people already address the likelihood of occurrence and the likelihood of impact. So if you focus on the magnitude of impact, then you choose continue, constraint, and reconstitute. These are the 3 objectives, which are mapped back to all of the NIST 800, 160, 853, and this is like a little tip that maybe not everybody knows. NIST 800, 160 is the first NIST publication that is fully mapped to MITRE attack. So you can then map that back to MITRE attack, including the impact tactics. So you should use the impact tactics to build your scenarios, right? The last 2 steps of the kill chain. And then based on that, you continue. now I'll pause for a moment because I think I'm talking too much.
So did everybody understand that? There's going to be a set of questions afterwards. No, but that's super interesting, right? And I learned a huge amount preparing for this panel, and it's really fascinating. And I was thinking about, well, you know, how does risk management fit into this in terms of quantitative risk management? And I think it's a way to help maybe identify some of those extreme scenarios, right? And think about how bad they could get and articulate them back to the organization in financial terms to try to fund some of this work, right?
I think from a risk management standpoint, I think the key fundamental building blocks are, first of all, we need to be clear on at what layer of the risk management framework we operate, right? Which is tied back to TOGAF and SAPSA architecture models. So we cannot talk interchangeably about a service or an asset. So we need to be clear, like in the pyramid you got of NIST 837, you know, you got the organization, the service, and the asset, right? So to your point before, I mean, the asset is defined as anything of value. That's how NIST defines it. But then you got Sticks, Taxi, or like adversarial models that say that asset is anything that they use as a tool to compromise. So we have to be clear in the taxonomies. And so that's the first point. If you're not clear on what an asset is if you don't have an asset taxonomy, people will talk about different things. And then the defensive control you put in place for a service are different than to an asset because these sit into different principal risk types, right? So that's fundamental. And the second element is, real quick, is on NIST 830, which defines then the threat events. So you need to be clear on the threat events, that then a series of threat events composes a threat scenario. So if you go granular at the indicators of compromise level with ingesting your TIP and CTI data and so on, then obviously that's too granular. That's why the community has evolved with the concept of indicators of behavior, which is a research project I'm in with Oasis and the university, the Johns Hopkins University, where we're actually looking at, and it's public, by the way. So you can look at the indicators of behavior, right? Map them to the threat events and the threat scenarios based on your threat intel.
And I thought it would be quite interesting. It kind of changed the way I think about assets, because I typically would think an asset is something that's of business value, but like you say, I think there's also benefit in building risk scenarios around some of those key, you know, high value targets, which typically will be shared infrastructure, right?
Yeah, oftentimes, well, they can be technical assets or business assets, right? We need to keep into account both. Actually, NIST 8286D, it's a publication that didn't get much publicity a couple of years ago, but you can look it up. It's actually very nice. So it challenges the way how we have been doing business impact analysis. So it brings together confidentiality, integrity, and availability in the way how you actually need to consider the asset value. I had another slide, I guess. Oh. If it goes. Oh.
No, not to worry. Not to worry.
Okay.
So maybe just, I know we're kind of starting to run out of time, and this is an interesting subject, and there's a lot of detail here. Again, the intent here is to give you some ideas about how to think about resiliency, and again, using standard models. But maybe just a bit back to Alstom, right? I mean, I know we spoke about the fact that you use an ISO control framework to think about risk scenarios. How do you take into consideration things which aren't necessarily a part of that control framework? For example, policy exceptions.
We take into account into a process where we are collecting actually gap with security policies from different processes like incident management, vulnerability management. We collect project management. We collect all those information to consolidate that into what we call the security depth, where we assess the risks here with FAIR methodology, and we assess what controls to implement and what action plans to implement in there. So, and this is where we need several types of stakeholders and to discuss with, and to be able to. So it's not about here. It's not about ISO control at level of the asset. It's not only about ISO controls. It's about every type of control that you want to implement. It could be any kind of control, processes, people. So we don't stick only to the ISO rules, but to other types of control.
And that's why I was kind of asking that question, is that idea that the control frameworks are great starting points, but ultimately this idea of building your own control library, which can be derived from the frameworks, but are things which are more measurable and can be...
It has to derive from the framework. So it depends on the granularity again. It has to, because you don't have the complete panel of possible controls. It's huge, you know, so depending on the gap that you have collected.
Okay, super. So I got maybe a last question for Francesco, and then we're going to wrap up. So we started the day talking about DORA, NIS2, and there's other regulations across Europe which we didn't talk about, but they have the same kind of intent. How do you think this regulatory framework will change the way that we think about resilience?
I think that it may not change actually the way how we look at resilience, because we may just go, if we don't do anything else but just rely on the regulator guidance, basically we will follow, as someone said earlier, we will just try to prepare to meet the compliance requirements. Cyber resilience, to be understood properly, requires quite a lot of passion, and actually it requires a lot of competencies as well. So it comes from the in-cause-like kind of product engineering, system engineering type of approach, right? Which requires quite some skills and a very much interdisciplinary kind of view on things. That's why, for example, I started discussions with both NIST, the NICE people, the competency framework people, and as well the ENISA competency framework, the ones among those that started defining like cyber resilience as one of the tasks of a CISO for European entities, and on actually trying to ensure that the skill set required to achieve a cyber resilient posture, and actually even understand the elements that make it to be something part of a day-to-day. The concept of a cyber resilience officer is one that I'm working on, and if anyone's interested, is an open concept. I think that the UK regulators have been quite ahead compared to many others, and but one regulation not to be forgotten is actually the CER, the Critical Entities Resilience Act from the European Union, which has a lot of business continuity components, but there's an intersection with cyber risk as well.
Super, great. Well, thank you very much. That was very interesting.
Welcome.
What we're going to do is we're going to switch over to Nick and Jack now. We're going to do some closing remarks and thank everybody again for attending today, but welcome Nick Sana and Jack Jones to the stage.
Thank you.
Thank you.